Today we continue our journey through the book of Genesis. Last week we summarized chapters about 12 through 21. And we heard the story of Abraham's son Ishmael, and how Ishmael and his wife Hagar were thrown out into the desert by Sarah, much to Abraham's consternation. But God saved Ishmael and Hagar because, of course, Ishmael's name means God hears. And their trauma was transformed. Grace was revealed in the form of a well in the desert. And so today we come to this story of Abraham's other son, Isaac. And it's a story that you may remember from your childhood because it's just so disconcerting. When I started to prepare for this week, knowing that we were doing this review of Genesis, and knowing also it was the day when we would be celebrating Vacation Bible School, and there would be a lot of children and a lot of visitors, particularly at the first service, I just shook my head. Oh, no. The story of the sacrifice of Isaac. I hate this story. I'm sorry. I do. I remember from my children's Bible a totally graphic, too graphic illustration of the sacrifice of Isaac. And boy, that knife was big and sharp looking. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. And it still does today. And so I'm inclined to agree with a commentator named Ellen Davis, who writes that if she had been editing the Bible, she would have taken out Genesis 22. And she says that if she had been questioned why, she would have said, first of all, that it puts the Old Testament in a bad light. And secondly, it puts God in a bad light. And then she says she would have further argued that by having Genesis 22 so close to the beginning of the Bible, that people would read to this story and then they'd stop. They wouldn't read anymore. And furthermore, they would question a God who would make such a terrible request and refuse to believe in him. Well, I would guess that there's more than one person who has thought the same thing. And in fact, I was preparing this week, and I always go to this online site called Working Preacher, and there was someone who had given an anonymous comment on the commentary for this text, and the person who gave the anonymous comment was absolutely convinced that indeed the story that we read today from Genesis 22 had been edited. This particular person, though, said that what was in the Bible is not the original story. And so he went on to say that what the original story is, now how this individual knows this, I'm not sure, but he says that the original story is that God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham did as God requested up until the point that it was clear that God was not going to intervene. At that point, Abraham looked up at God and said, basically, you've got to be kidding me. I'm not going to do this. This isn't right. This doesn't fit with the promises you have made to me, and therefore that ram over there in the thicket is going to have to do. At which point, this person says, God declared Abraham as truly righteous, and Abraham and his son went on their way with no negative consequences. Now, the person who's saying that that's the original story story says that it was changed to the story we read today because someone couldn't stand the thought that it would be possible to disobey God and get away with it. Now, I have no idea. I'd have to do extensive study, read materials by people much smarter than I to know if there's any validity to that comment made by this anonymous person. But I can tell you that I like that story better. I do. I'm sorry. I do. And perhaps many of us like that story better because the one we read today is just so upsetting. To think that God would require God's servant to sacrifice the child that God had promised. It's just so upsetting. But then, isn't much of life upsetting? And isn't it often true that we don't understand how God is involved in the midst of our various circumstances? And so therefore, maybe this story has something to say about that. Look, for example, at the way Abraham responded to what God asked of him. Abraham did not turn his back on a relationship with God, even though it seemed as though God was turning everything upside down. Remember, for those between chapter 12 and chapter 21, no less than 3 times, God said to Abraham, "You and Sarah will be the ancestors of a great nation." And it took all those years. And finally, when Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 90, they welcomed their son Isaac. And the fact that it happened when they were that well advanced in age is only proof that God was involved in the birth of Isaac. And then just a few chapters later, God, well, let's put it this way, the promise is threatened. And who threatens it? None other than the one who made it. And so we ask ourselves, why is Abraham so compliant in this story? Abraham doesn't argue. Abraham doesn't weep. There's no report of Abraham trying to bargain with God. Why is Abraham so compliant? Well, many commentators, I will tell you, say it's a matter of obedience. But I have to tell you, I struggle with that because obedience is only good if the end result is just, at least in my opinion. And in this story, the end result, I don't think, is righteous. So, what's the answer? Why is Abraham so compliant? Could this be a story about faith? Could the fact of the matter be that given all that they have been through together, God and Abraham, that Abraham trusts God that much? Abraham trusts God with their child, meaning God's and Abraham's child. Wow. Could we trust God that much? It's an astounding thing. The commentator I mentioned earlier, Ellen Davis, says that she can hardly believe it either, and it reminds her of a book that she read. Now, I've never heard of this book, but it's called With God in Hell. And it's written by a man whose last name is Berkowitz. And Mr. Berkowitz, in his book, is trying to answer the question, why Jews during World War II, in the ghettos in Germany and in the Nazi death camps, why? Why did they continue to pray? Why did they continue to put their lives at risk to observe the Sabbath? Why did they proclaim God as the Holy One, the Blessed One of the universe, instead of shaking their fists at God and cursing God who apparently had abandoned them? Why? And Mr. Berkowitz turns to the story of Abraham and Isaac for an answer. And he says he has this vision of Abraham having a conversation with God. And Abraham says to God, I don't understand what you're asking me to do. It's totally against the promises we have made with one another. I don't want to do it. But I trust you. I trust you and me. I trust us. So Abraham trusts God with their child. And for Abraham to live is to live with God. If he's alive, then he lives with God. And Mr. Berkowitz said that he believes that that's what was true for the faithful Jews in the death camps and the ghettos. They could not live life, regardless of the circumstances. They could not live life apart from God. And so the answer is, why was Abraham so compliant? The answer is that he trusted God. But then you have people like me who struggle with the story and say, was God trustworthy? Why would God test Abraham in this way? Why? Now, many scholars say it is, and it's sort of alluded to in Scripture, but I don't think it's a done deal because of what it says in Scripture, but many scholars say it's because God wanted to make sure that Abraham was trustworthy. Because, Abraham had messed up every now and then as the story unfolded. That doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to me that God would know everything there is to know about Abraham. So, what I think is this. I think Abraham needed to know the strength of his ability to trust God. So that, as he fulfilled his role as the father of a great nation, as he witnessed to his faith to those who came after him, Abraham could say, look, if I could trust God in that circumstance, that I can trust God through anything. And so can you. You see, this story is about relationship. That's probably the most astounding thing about it. We get caught up in the gruesomeness of the story, and we forget this is a story about relationship. That the relationship between God and Abraham, between God and humanity, is based not in compulsion. You must believe. You must trust. You must. It's based in trust. And therefore, the response can grow out of not fear, but love. Which means that in the end, there can be good. Not that which is, I'd call it contrived, because it's done in fear. And yet, our relationship with God is often bewildering. I like that word, bewildering. We just don't understand. And so all we can pray for, and this is a lot to pray for, is that whatever the circumstances are, we would be like Abraham or like the Jews in the death camps. That we would be unable to live life apart from God. Even when we're confused. And that we would realize that the promise is that there will be a well in the desert or a ram in the thicket. In other words, God's love for us will be revealed. Because God is faithful.